So my name is Caroline Aitken, and I'm an educator and a land consultant based in Devon, in southwest England. I teach permaculture and agroecology, and I advise people on creating diverse and integrated land systems. And I'm going to be chairing and facilitating this session, which I'm really excited to do as we look at how we can view farmers as keystone species. So the old conservation debate about land sharing versus land sparing has created this false dichotomy of either farming or nature, which is indicative of the intrinsic sense of separation that's developed between humans and our ecosystems, certainly in the industrial world. So even at conferences like this one, we're often faced with choices as conversations are siloed. So do you go to the session on rewilding, or do you go to the session on regen ag? So this session brings together representatives from 3 different organisations who are working to reconnect humans with wildness through farming. And so this requires a shift in mindset, which I feel is fundamental to our future, to see ourselves as part of our ecosystems and to view our behaviours, or some of them at least, as natural. So how might we do that, and how would it look in practice? So I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers who are going to reflect on these ideas through their own practices on some really inspiring projects in the UK. And they are Caroline Grindrod of Rewilding and Roots of Nature, Russ Carrington from Knepp Regenerative Farms, and Miriam MacDonald and Rob Owen of Holistic Restoration. So I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn and then hand over to them to show you and tell you a little bit more about their work. So I just want to say before we start that we do have, we're a little bit tight on time, we've got an hour. We're really hoping that we'll have time to answer some of your questions at the end. So I'd like to get through the presentations first, and then we'll see if we've got time to answer some questions. But if you do have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A facility on the toolbar at the bottom, rather than the chat. Just makes it easier for us to tease those questions out. And so, right, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Caroline Grindrod. And Caroline is co-founder and director of Rewilding CIC and owner of the consultancy Roots of Nature Limited. So Caroline helps to design, train and coach in regenerative food and farming systems. And she has a background in environmental conservation, hill farming and food-related businesses. And she brings those skills together as an accredited professional in holistic management to support individuals and businesses to transition towards systems that go far beyond being simply sustainable. So Rewilding is a community interest company and a land management approach. The Rewilding approach is best described as a hybrid of regenerative grazing and rewilding, designed for the uplands, and it's underpinned by the holistic management framework. So in Rewilding, Caroline and the team train farmers and upland estate or farm owners to become conscious keystone species. So helping the team to design and implement bespoke regenerative management plans that will improve effectiveness of the ecosystem processes and are socially and culturally appropriate and economically self-sustaining. Some really key things there. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline, whose presentation is actually recorded. She will explain why. So I'm going to share this with you now.
Yes, thanks, Caroline, for the introduction. I apologise, I've got a terrible internet connection, which is just going to delay things. So I've done a little pre-record just earlier, and hopefully that will do, and I'll be on for Q&A. Thanks, Caroline.
Okay, so I'm going to hit play, and please let me know if you don't hear Caroline.
Hello everyone, thanks Caroline for the introduction, and I've actually ended up having to do a pre-record because my internet has been so bad, so apologies for that, but I just thought it was safer than buffering in and out when we've got such a short time to get through it all. So my name is Caroline Grindrod, and I have a consultancy called Roots of Nature, where we are, helping people to transition to regenerative agriculture. And I also I'm the founder and co-director of an organisation called Rewilding, where we're really looking at upland environments and what does this regenerative agriculture stuff look like in the uplands, and how might that intersect with rewilding. So I guess the way I wanted to tackle this today was really sort of look into this concept of, what is natural anyway? When did we have this natural thing that we're all trying and think about getting back to? And if we are thinking about handing back land to nature and sort of resetting the ecology, if that's how we're thinking of it in rewilding often, where does that leave us as humans if we're handing it back to nature? Are we no longer part of it? Are we not natural? So in wilderculture, we very much think of ourselves as part of the ecosystem. And I just wanted to take you through a little journey of how we kind of came to that thinking. So I guess it's great to go back to the start where we might have what's thought of as the wild Britain, the original ancient wild wood is what we were told once upon a time. It was a closed canopy forest. And of course now Franz Vera has sort of made us realise that actually probably it was more likely to be a kind of scruffy parkland, open savanna type environment with lots of herbivores driving that ecology. So yeah, some sort of temperate savanna with small bands of herbivores running around maintaining that ecosystem. And in that ecosystem, of course, we would have had lots of trees, so the nutrient uplift would have been significant. We've got trees bringing nutrients and sort of the base biology up to the surface of the habitat, and then of course the nutrient cycle and the mineral cycle, which we talk much more about in regenerative agriculture, would have been driven and accelerated by this whole process of browsing animals, grazing animals, the digestion of the animals, the dung in the system. All of those things would have contributed to a very healthy soil structure and a very fertile soil. And of course, the other thing that we don't talk about that much in sort of conservation and rewilding is the energy flow. So this picture on the left, where we've got a lot of rank vegetation, tends to happen when you remove herbivores from the environment, and that in itself is incredibly limiting in terms of the potential for biodiversity. And we talk about this a lot in regenerative agriculture, but not so much in rewilding and conservation. But if we've got herbivores maintaining a healthy, vigorous green plant rather than allowing it to go long, tall, and dead, which it would never have probably done in a what we might call wild natural system, where herbivores are eating the grasses all the time and maintaining that greenness, and sort of maintaining the trees and the browse and things as well, we would have had a huge amount of photosynthesis happening in that land base, if you like. And of course, we're only going to be limited to how many adders we can have or golden eagles that we can support on a land base. If we have only, if we have X number of adders, we need triple X number of plants photosynthesizing to support the kind of the food web below that predator species or that higher trophic species. So in regenerative agriculture, we spend a lot of time looking at how do we increase the rate and capacity of photosynthesis at that soil level. So, of course, Franz Vera talks a lot about the fact that he doesn't believe predators were the really important part in terms of maintaining the population of the different herbivore groups. And, of course, that's certainly true to some degree. And I think one thing that's very important that he points out is that the death and decay in these systems from the animals dying and being limited by the bottom up and these resources would be significant. And that's going to look very different in a modern conservation project or a rewilding project. People no longer like the look of, death and decay. And certainly in farming, it's not even legal. So that's going to be a very big missing and different piece of the puzzle in our management. And although it's certainly true to say that predators could, there's only a limit to so many, them being able to eat so many deer. A wolf can only eat so many deer. A lynx can only eat so many roe deer. So that probably wasn't the main factor in limiting the actual population number. But the influence of these predators was really, really important. And of course, we talk about this a lot in both rewilding in terms of using Yellowstone and these trophic cascades as an example of how predators rebalance the ecology. But in regenerative agriculture, obviously, we think of ourselves as the predators, and we are mimicking the behaviour of the interactions with the predators and the influence they would have on those grazing animals in order to maintain the nutrient cycling and the energy flow of the system, which in turn supports not only our grazing animals but our overall biodiversity. And Professor and ecologist Tony Sinclair, from his lifetime work on in the Serengeti has shown us that actually it's not as simple as thinking that it's either or, herbivores are regulated from the bottom up, or herbivores are more regulated from the top down, or it's really very complex, and every different species is going to be slightly different. And then the interactions between all of them together means that it's completely interconnected, in flux all the time. It's totally dynamic. It'll change depending on the season, the climatic changes, the composition of the grazing groups. Everything is just in constant flux. And I think that's a lovely illustration that actually nature is completely dynamic and self-organizing. It's not this machine that we can understand and then simply just reset to a sort of earlier point in time when it was more natural. The result of this fluctuating and changing composition of herbivores would mean that your habitats were an outcome of that. So the more grazers you've got, the more grasslands you're probably going to get, and the less grazers you've got, the more different habitats might start to come in. Scrub up and take over by woodland takeover, or turn to rank grassland and then acidify and become peatlands. So, rather than in conventional conservation where we think of, okay, that's the habitat that should be there, and therefore we're going to manage for that habitat, I think we're all coming from, in rewilding and regenerative agriculture, a different angle, which is that actually these habitats are more of an outcome than, it's the other way around. So it's self-organizing, and it's complex, and nature isn't a machine that you can simply return to a set point by reinstating a particular piece of the puzzle or a predator or anything else. It's changed forever. It's adapted. And then, of course, we get into the thorny issue of us humans. Where do we fit into this natural system? And at what point did we shift from being a natural part of the ecosystem as hunting predators to becoming the destroyers of that ecosystem, if that's how we are often thought of these days? So when did we decide that we needed to get out of the ecosystem in order for it to be more natural? We were actually just another predator for a very long time. So when early humans killed game and protected themselves from predators, we would have influenced and changed the delicate ecological balance, just as any other predator would have done as it fluctuated in population size. But over time, obviously, our brains grew, we evolved, and we became able to take up bigger tools that had a bigger impact on our environment. And of course, that's where things started to get rather out of balance. So we would have cut down many more trees, killed many more wild animals, leaving our uplands very exposed, and that mineral cycling less effective, energy flow less effective. So the result would have been probably a much more exposed upland environment where the fertility was kind of running downhill and collapsing, if you like. And then an acidification and a development of peatlands and a denuding of the landscape to some degree. And of course, in modern land management, we're now looking at the decisions around what's more natural. What should we be managing for? Should we be managing it as a peatland, or should we be managing it for the kind of wild wood that it might have been before it was peatland? Certainly, there's lots of trees coming back in those areas if we allow them to, and should herbivores be a bigger part of that system. And of course, we then continued to change the landscape. We farmed more, became much more active role in the ecosystem, but that wasn't all bad, and it certainly wasn't all negative. And many of the the herding systems throughout the uplands of the world created a very biodiverse, positive ecological outcome. And Fraser Darling in the Highland Survey talks about the fact that he feels it was when we shifted the ratio of herbivores and managed animals between one cow to 20 sheep, and when it shifted more in favour of more sheep, or we totally removed the cattle, or there's less ponies, then that was when things really started to deteriorate in the upland environments. And of course we compounded that by often we breed the animals in the uplands, and then we either drove them somewhere else to be finished or sell them on. And of course, that's sort of kind of mineral exporting that we've been doing for a very long time. And here we are now as modern humans with a very an ecosystem that's on the edge of collapse, basically. And I was very tempted to write, when I was writing the title here, Modern Agriculture. And then I realised that it's so important that we remember that we're all part of this system that's ended up being here. We all have benefited from the cheap food. It wasn't the case that farmers went in first and decided, I want to create this modern agriculture that's, you know, inadvertently damaged the ecosystem. It's been in response to the changes driven by the government, which in turn, you know, has been driven by us. It's a very complex set of you know, things that have happened, but it's ended up that we have got we have got an ecosystem on the point of ecological collapse. So we really do need to stop arguing about who got us here and who's at fault, and really just get around to fixing this thing. And the great thing is that one of the outcomes of this situation is that we have emerged as humans that can manage complexity better. We can now adopt and learn a holistic perspective that allows us to work with complex living systems in a much more effective way. And then we can also use, we have frameworks like the holistic management framework we'll talk about in a second to help us manage that. So really we are tool using creatures, and of course throughout time we have had a negative impact and sometimes a positive, but it needn't be that way. It's really just a case of us being more conscious keystone species. We need to learn how an ecosystem works. We need to learn what our part is that we can play in that ecosystem, and then we used to use our consciousness and our ability to plan ahead to make better decisions that are going to regenerate that ecosystem rather than degrade them. And this is the holistic management framework that underpins all of the work, my work in wilderculture and roots of nature. And this is an amazing framework for managing complexity. It's where we look at understanding principles and applying them. And we can then take our role as a keystone species, and we can say, you know, our job is to look at the herbivores that are under our influence and the livestock, and how can we best apply those in terms of the grazing plan to achieve the ecological outcomes that we want to. Wilderculture is a community interest company. It's a not-for-profit organisation, and we're really dedicated to trying to understand how to do this. You know, become conscious keystone species in our upland environment. So we test, demonstrate and teach a hybrid of rewilding and regenerative grazing for the uplands, and we use an adapted version of the holistic management framework. And we work with several key projects in a sort of a deeper, longer term way. And then we also offer kind of consultancy and coaching and ongoing support for people that go through our training courses. So by working with upland landowners, we teach and support the transition to upland management that produces nutrient-dense foods, enhances the lives of the people associated with the land, and is profitable in ways that regenerate rather than degrade the underlying ecosystem. And I'm conscious of running out of time, so I'm just going to flick through a few nice pictures. Here's Sam at Gowborough, doing his bit of being a predator and managing his fencing system. This is on the island of Carna, where we have our earliest project, Wild Carna. These are the cows on the island enjoying the sea. It's just one of our training courses that we run at Gowborough. That's managing the livestock in a way that's going to regenerate towards a wood pasture. A lovely new project that we're working with up at Blair Athol Estate, where we've got some remnant pine woods to work out how to actively regenerate. That's great. I think we've run out of time. So thanks ever so much, everybody, for listening, and I'll be available for the Q&A.
Okay, that was great. Thank you so much, Caroline. It was lovely to hear about the work that you're doing and to see the photos of it all at the end. It's really great. I'm aware that we need to sort of move on quickly, yeah, just to kind of respond to some of the things that Caroline said in her presentation. You know, that this is really, you know, in recent years we've had some very sort of long established ideas challenged in quite a radical way. So at the very beginning, Caroline mentioned this idea of the wildwood in Britain. People used to say that a squirrel could run from the very north of Scotland to the very south tip of Cornwall, just across the treetops without touching the ground. So to suddenly kind of challenge that idea has been quite radical. And also this idea that ecosystems are static and stay in the same place. Yeah, that was really beautifully described. Thank you, Caroline. Okay, so I'm going to move on to Russ, who can tell us more about what he's doing. So Russ Carrington is the manager of Knepp Regenerative Farms, which is a relatively new venture on the renowned Rewilding estate, Knepp Estate in Sussex, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. So Russ grew up on a family farm, a mixed farm in Herefordshire, went off to study civil engineering, and after a period of work and travel, decided that he wanted to return to farming, and was keen to play a role in helping food production and rural societies become fit for the future. So he spent 10 years at the helm of the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, and then joined the Knepp Estate in West Sussex to establish a new regenerative farming business. And so the aim of this new business is to investigate how a joined up approach between different land management techniques can aid nature recovery on a landscape scale. Russ has also been very active in rural youth movements, both nationally and internationally, having previously been chairman of the Rural Youth Europe and chairman of the Agricultural and Rural Issues Steering Group for the National Federation of Young Farmer Clubs in England and Wales. And he's a strong advocate for sustainable farming and change leadership. So over to you, Russ.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Caroline, and hello everyone. It's really great to be here, albeit virtual. I'm just going to give a quick run through of what we're doing at Knepp with the regenerative farm and how this fits in with rewilding, and also highlight how the people are involved in this and the key role that different figures have played. And I wanted to start really by giving my my thoughts on what regenerative agriculture is, and of course it's a term that's regularly bandied around, and I often think about farming being on a spectrum, or all sorts of different farming systems being on a spectrum, and that as illustrated here, we might look at what's in the middle as being sustainable, just managing the status quo, and what's to the right is about regenerating and working towards perhaps rewilding or perhaps towards something else. And in the opposing direction, we're degenerating, and that's leading us to desertification. And we know around the world that most farming probably sits slightly to the left of the sustainable mark, and what the future perhaps needs to be as being advocated is moving everybody to the right, and that's going to mean different things for different people, but specifically for things like soil and other particular metrics that we might want to consider in our farming systems. This is how they might look in a sort of directional form. And I do get asked a lot about, what is regenerative farming? What's the quick definition? And really, there is no quick definition, and it's no quick fix. So it's more about the mindset shift and thinking about direction and the journey, not just the destination as well. And I love the principles advocated by the Groundswell Agricultural Show, the Cherries and Co. And I love this sort of list of things that they've brought together, and others around the world now are sort of centering around this list that are the principles of regenerative agriculture. I think the most interesting one really is at the end, the integration of livestock into the system, which, as Caroline's already highlighted, those livestock are so crucial to a functioning ecosystem. So here at Knepp, and I've been based at Knepp now for nearly a year, based in West Sussex, and I'm sure many of you will have heard of Knepp, but if you haven't, it's a fascinating story and a fascinating place that was actively farming 20 years ago, quite intensively farming on very heavy clay. And the family around 20 years ago were facing rising debts in their farming business, and struggled to see a way forward with their methodology, and took the very brave step to try something completely radical and to let the land rewild itself. And so after initial pulse of letting nature come back and vegetation grow back, they then reintroduced grazing herbivores and some pigs to help drive the dynamism in this rewilding landscape. And it's been absolutely fascinating what has happened there, and how that has not just affected land management in this area on 3,500 acres, but also affected thinking right around the world in how nature can return to quite barren farmland. And of course, there is the book Wilding, written by Isabella Tree, which is well worth a read if you haven't, but details a lot of what has been done on the estate. The good news for those that are not so keen on reading is that this is being made into a film, so keep an eye out for that as well. So how does regenerative farming fit in at Knepp with the rewilding? Well, here's a map of the Knepp estate, and there are 3 rewilding areas which are shaded in blue here: the northern block, the middle block or park block, and then the southern block. And those areas are really defined by roads, and they were what were practical to establish a ring fence for the grazing herbivores in a confined and safe area without having to need to cross roads, bringing perhaps bigger problems. So there was an element of the estate that I've got shaded here in green that was not rewilded because it wasn't practical to do so. And so this land is now forming the new regenerative farm. And this land was divided by the roads, and so it wasn't feasible to let the free roaming animals move into those areas. So they've been tenanted out on short-term grazing leases. Some of them have been used for managing some of the stock, like the bulls that were are not kept in the rewilding all of the time. And some of the land has been anyway let to rewild, and they're sort of spread around, and there's 43 fields in total. And so the estate approached me last year about turning this land into a project to really help us understand some key principles for regenerative agriculture and how they can fit with rewilding. So there's really 3 key aims for the regenerative project at Knepp, but it's about understanding how different land management types that are sat alongside one another can actually benefit nature overall and benefit nature's recovery through the landscape. And further understand, how is this system actually working in West Sussex in these heavy clay soils, and how it can work alongside rewilding, but ultimately also produce some tasty, healthy local food for the local community and for visitors that come to Knepp. And that's really important. In my previous experience with the Pasture Fed Livestock Association, really so crucial to think about our markets and how we're going to make money as a business, and what's the demand for our produce. So we've really settled on these 4 key areas of beef production, egg production, dairy production, and fresh fruit and vegetables. And they're very much our aspirations. And starting from ground zero less than 12 months ago, I've been steadily leading our mission to achieve those products, but in a regenerative way as far as possible. So got the beef herd established, which I'll come back to a little bit more, looking into launching the poultry this year. Market garden is underway, and we've just recruited growers for that. And ultimately we will have a micro dairy as well to complement everything else that's going on. And these enterprises are essentially stacked onto that land, and they are also making use of shared infrastructure, which I'll come to in a little bit, but things like fencing, things like pasture management, things like infrastructure, water, all those sort of costs that are needed for running a farm practically, to try and work together and really sweat those assets, those costs, to support those enterprises. So we've been mob grazing a Sussex herd of cattle, so the Sussex breed, local to Sussex, given the name obviously, but that's different to the Longhorns that are running in the rewilding. And we've been mob grazing them on a very simple electric fence system since they arrived back in June last year. And that's been really fun to get them doing it. They were some of them were quite wild cattle when we first bought them, and really they've switched the system very, very well. And we're grazing a variety of different pastures. There's lots of different pasture types across the farm, and here they are in a reasonably diverse lay, but sort of predominantly clover and modern grasses. Whereas here we've been, and this is a sort of drone footage of me doing a mob move from one paddock to the left, from on the left to the right, with much more scrubby pastures where already trees are beginning to get established, and you can see sort of pathways through the scrub these animals are starting to create. And here's a sort of close-up of them a few weeks ago as they were grazing in that field for the second time. And there's this sort of low ground scrub, which we're trying to encourage a little bit, but also keep in check as we're thinking about how we can manage for nature in particular and create habitat, not just around the edges of the fields, but within the fields as well. And we're doing a bit of bale grazing as well to try and break up some of those scrubby areas. and to allow those animals to come in and disturb those areas and make them more dynamic. We are going to be doing a bit of winter housing though, and then brought them in just before Christmas. We've got a few barns, not to house all the animals, but some to start with. And here we are using wood chip and some shredded paper, actually from the Knepp office, to start our bedding off. And last summer we did that again last winter, and so we'll be composting that in the barns over the summer. And that's now out in windrows in preparation for our market garden. So we're continuing to turn that and learning about compost, which is a whole sort of fascinating angle in itself, but it's all about closing the loop and bringing those nutrients from the beef enterprise into the market garden to help produce food for humans. And this is the market garden at the moment, with a green manure growing of mustard and phacelia, which is very interesting in itself, thinking about how we're going to very intensively manage in a no-dig sense and organically as well, to produce lots of fruit and vegetables for a new farm shop that's being developed at Knepp. And that's a whole new interesting thing as well, and sort of breaking earth, creating bare earth is a bit of a foreign concept for me, but it's been an interesting learning curve. But quickly moving on, and certainly in terms of the term regenerative farming that's often used, I think it's also important that we are able to evidence and justify why we're using that term and able to demonstrate what we're actually regenerating. And so this is a quick diagram of all of the things that we're trying to measure across the regenerative farm and take baseline measurements of before we really enact major changes through a new management type. And so this list could go on, but really it's about taking a triple bottom line, a major focus, yes, on nature, but also looking about the economic and financial performance, not just of the business, but how that affects things locally, other local businesses, and contribution to the local economy, and particularly social aspects, how we are helping other humans living in the area, working on the land, using the land for footpaths, walking their dogs and so forth, or even so eating produce from the farm. So we're trying to take an all-round holistic triple bottom line view. And so we've been busy taking lots of baseline measurements for many of the things on that diagram, in particular soil and all manner of things we're measuring for soil. We've chosen just 8 survey fields out of the 43. Those 8 fields have had a particular type of management in the past, so there's different starting points, which is fascinating in itself. One of those 8 fields is also...
Sorry, Russ, two-minute warning on your time.
Okay. And so we've got that control of the neighbour's field to compare what we're doing. So dung beetles is another one we've been doing, help from dung beetles for farmers, measuring small mammals such as these little voles in our pastures, moths, and all manner of other insects that are living in the pastures and around the edges of the pastures. And this frosty morning the other day really helped indicate just how much spider life was in our pastures. Just imagine how many flies they are catching and eating. But how do we connect to the rewilding? Well, we've been thinking in lots of different ways how that might happen, particularly making use of watercourses as natural corridors for us to help certain species infiltrate the landscape, and also our hedgerows and woodlands, and how we can help to connect them up to help species travel, wild species travel from the rewilding through the regenerative farm and perhaps on to our other neighbours as well. That's got us really thinking about our hedgerow management and what the hedges look like at the moment, and what maybe they ought to become with a much more diverse structure and gradient. Excellent hedgerow session yesterday morning at the conference as well, worth checking out if you didn't see it. But how can we actually create these things easily in a farming system whilst also trying to produce food? And the cost of having expensive fencing materials, which is increasingly getting higher. And so the electric fencing, temporary fencing, works quite well in that respect. But what we find really interesting is our trials with the no fence collars and how they allow a really kind of dynamic edging and ecotones along our field edges and the boundaries, which I've been trialing out with the app, No Fence app, which gives some really interesting information on how those animals are actually interacting with different areas. And here's some screenshots of me putting in an exclusion zone and seeing how the animals interact with that over a few days using the heat maps, and lots of data to feedback from that. And just really to finish, I wanted to highlight how we've been involving the local community. And here we've got some people from the local village who've been helping us with brown hair streak butterfly egg hunting on blackthorn. And here is actually one of the hedgerows which we've let grow out a little bit with some tusky grass to the bottom there. So we've got local villagers involved in that. We've also developed a group of volunteers that are once a fortnight coming out helping with jobs on the farm, such as removing old fencing from hedgerows, and they absolutely love that. And I could talk a lot more about how beneficial that has been for both me and for those volunteers. But all of this and much more than 10 minutes has been captured in the podcast, which I did with Penny Green just before Christmas, worth checking out on the Knepp Wildland podcast if you want an hour's in-depth live coverage of the regenerative farm to your ears. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Russ. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for talking us through that, and more fantastic pictures, and really lovely to hear the way that you're including the social ecosystems and everything you're doing as well. Okay, so moving on to our final presentation, which is from Miriam MacDonald and Rob Owen. They are co-directors of Holistic Restoration, which is an education, research and land consultancy working across the UK. So Mim and Rob both have backgrounds in ecology, agriculture, community engagement and research. And they've both gained extensive experience of working with a range of farming enterprises in the UK and overseas. They formed a partnership to further their concept of holistic restoration, an approach to land management which restores landscapes and people as a single entity. They offer talks and courses on holistic restoration. And Miriam has a new book out, which is called Emergent, which I can highly recommend. It's brilliant, which offers a fascinating insight into humans in our ecosystems and why the rewilding of both humans and landscapes is important for our collective future. Okay, so over to you, Miriam and Rob.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you, Russ and Caroline, for sharing as well. And thank you, everyone, for being here and listening to this. So why are we here in this room, or whatever we're in right now? To many people, it's probably clear that we're not separate from nature. But the question that follows that is, then what are we? So the way that me and Miriam are going to approach this today is start off by looking at what our past ecological roles have been as humans in Britain, and then using this to help us try and reimagine what our future roles might be. So I'm going to pass pretty quickly over to Mim to start exploring what our past roles might have been.
Thanks, Rob, and hi, everyone. I'm assuming that everyone listening is a Homo sapien, and Homo sapiens are a member of the genus Homo. There used to be quite a few different Homo species around the world, but all the others are now extinct. A member of the Homo genus has lived in Britain on and off for nearly 1 million years, and over that time Britain's changed quite dramatically, alternating between ice ages and interglacials similar to today. About 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthals arrived here. They were a close relative of ours, and also in the genus Homo. They moved in and out of Britain as the ice expanded and retreated for the next 360,000 years or so, leaving when the conditions got too extreme and returning when the climate warmed up again. Next slide, please, Rob. Cool, thank you. During the interglacials, the Neanderthals lived here alongside a variety of other species. Some of them are seen in this image, hanging out in what is now London. All these species, including elephants, rhinos, lions, hyenas, hippos, I think, as well in there, were interacting with each other and also with the vegetation growing here, creating a massively complex web of dynamic habitats. There would have been elephants and big herbivores aggressively browsing trees and pushing them over, and other species eating the various grazers or moving plant seeds around in their guts. This would have promoted plant growth in some areas and like halted it in other areas. All of this activity and the interaction between plant growth and consumption would have created these hugely complex intermingled landscapes of woodlands, trees, grasslands and wetlands. These sorts of complex moving habitats would have always been evolving and adapting, and we call them dynamic mosaics. They're the sort of habitats that Caroline was talking about earlier in her video. The species that were creating these landscapes were keystone species. We've also heard a bit about them earlier and the interactions that they played with landscapes. Although it's not technically a part of the definition of a keystone species, keystones do very often create the landscapes that sustain them. So, for example, a grazer, like a wild cow, grazes an area which eventually creates a grassland. This grassland then grows grass and other herbs that feed the cow and her descendants, who in turn maintain the grassland by grazing it. So the keystone and the habitat can be thought of as creating one another. Next slide, please, Rob. So how does all this relate to us? Well, humans, Neanderthals for the first few 100,000 years or so, and then us for the last few thousand, have been filling similar roles in these dynamic landscapes. So far, we've talked quite a bit about keystone herbivores and carnivores, but there's also another group of keystones called keystone omnivores. And people, as well as bears and pigs, are keystone omnivores, and their roles in ecosystems differ slightly from those of keystone herbivores and carnivores. So while herbivores and carnivores tend to be fairly tightly tied to eating either plant or animal matter, keystone omnivores can eat a mixture of both, meaning that they can have similar effects to the carnivores and herbivores, but they can also have some interesting and unique effects of their own. So people, pigs and bears are all quite happy to eat, say, like shellfish on the coast and then head inland to eat deer in the woods or collect blackberries from scrubland. And they'd be quite happy to shift their diet over the year as different things became available. So this is the first part of our keystone omnivore role. We eat whatever's plentiful and easy to get hold of as it appears over the year. The second part of our role is related to the first, because in order to find pools of seasonally available food, keystone omnivores have to wander over quite large distances. As they wander, they often carry things with them in their guts. So, for example, if a bear or a person had had a meal of blackberries in a woodland edge and then went off in search of shellfish, it's highly likely that on the way to the coast, they would have had to go to the toilet at some stage and leave a load of blackberry seeds in a nice pile of dung. So the keystone omnivores often spread plant seeds around a landscape. The final trait of keystone omnivores is again related to the first trait, well, the first two traits, because as they forage for food, they often create disturbances. So, for example, a pig or a person digging for tubers opens up a patch of bare ground in an otherwise vegetated area, and that creates a new sort of habitat. Next slide, please, Rob. The culmination of all of this eating and wandering and disturbing helps to create and maintain a dynamic landscape, just like the other types of keystone species. So where keystone herbivores and carnivores help promote a diversity of different types of plant growth, keystone omnivores tend to steady landscapes. Because pigs, bears and people are so good at changing our diets and eating whatever's most available, we can help to ensure that no species gets overabundant in an area by eating it. This helps to ensure that the ecosystem remains stable over time. Keystone omnivores also help to raise diversity of landscapes, because by transporting seeds around and also making small disturbances in the vegetation cover, we can spread plants about and open up areas for different species to colonize. So in short, for the majority of the history of the Homo genus, we've actually helped to create and maintain diverse, dynamic and stable landscapes in Britain. But obviously that isn't our main role in ecosystems today. And I'm going to pass back to Rob now, and he's going to talk a bit more about the shift from keystone omnivore to what we are today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mim. So a lot's changed in the last 10,000 years for the UK and for Britain and the people on it. To start with a couple of physical changes which have happened is So 10,000 years ago, by 10,000 years ago, we had lost all of our interglacial megafauna. And along with that, about 8,500 years ago, the land bridge connecting Britain to continental Europe flooded for the most recent time. So what this meant is we'd be left with the island of Britain that we know today, devoid of the megafauna and the key processes that they brought to the island. Then about 6,000 years ago, some plucky people on boats brought over some livestock and some seed, and agriculture was birthed in Britain. This gave way to the slow move away from hunting and gathering to a kind of form of nomadic agriculture. Eventually, with permanent agriculture, and permanent field systems emerging about 3,500 years ago. So what we think this represents is a shift in the balance of our ecosystem roles as humans. So as Mim mentioned, we are keystone species, but we can also be seen as ecosystem engineers. These are really similar roles, and often there's a blurry line between them, and species can sit within both. But I think it's really useful to be able to see the differences between them. So they're both similar to start with in the fact that they both create, maintain, and modify habitats. But scientists kind of define them slightly differently in a couple of ways. One is that keystones often exist in small population sizes in relation to the large effect that they have in their landscape. And also the effects they have on their landscape tend to be indirect changes due to their diet, whereas ecosystem engineers tend to make direct changes to the structure of their landscapes or ecosystems. So I think taking these two definitions into account, I think we could see this move from hunter-gatherer to agriculture as a shift or a change in balance between the keystone and ecosystem engineer role that we hold. So what impact does that have? So typically, ecosystem engineers raise biodiversity in the landscape. They create novel patches within the wider ecosystem, and in doing so, they increase the complexity of habitats in that ecosystem and the processes that come along with that, eventually leading to raising biodiversity. However, as you scale up that impact of that ecosystem engineer, often that can flip itself inside out, and you end up with what could look like monocultures and a loss in diversity. And this might sound similar to some of you. So fast forward 10,000 years to where we are now, and what have we done to our landscape? To try and boil that down into three different things, we could say, first, we've simplified our landscape. We say, here's a field of wheat over here, here's a woodland over there. And alongside that, the second thing we've done is we've scaled up our impacts. Our fields have got larger, the areas that we plough and the tractors have got larger, and this is really changing our landscape. And the third change that you can see is we've frozen them in time, where we used to have this dynamic dance between wetting and drying and wooding and grassing in our landscape. We now froze it and say, this is a woodland here, and this is a grassland here. And this really looks like the end of the dynamic mosaic that both created us and we created. And the consequences of doing this is this loss in diversity that we see around us, and hand in hand in that is the instability in ecological systems and agroecosystems at all scales. I think that's kind of what's brought us together. We're all here at this conference looking for a way in which humans can thrive in a whole and an intact world. So, looking into the future a bit, we want to invite you to reimagine our role in ecosystems. Farmers, foresters, humans have been keystone species and ecosystem engineers for a long time and still are. And we think we've got the opportunity to consciously step back into these roles and into this dance with the rest of the world. We no longer have wild boars, but we have that would turn over bare soil, letting space for animals in, but we have their descendants, the pig, and we have the plough. We no longer have straight-tusked elephants that would knock over trees, let light into the forest floor, and create complexity within forest systems, but we have men with chainsaws. We no longer have roaming herds of herbivores, creating grassland as they move, but we have our cattle. And we no longer have the wolves and other predators that would change where cattle were in the landscape and let woodland pop up after them, but we do have our herdsmen. So I guess what we're trying to say, and what I can see from this, is it's possible to dissolve those preconceived barriers between agriculture and conservation. there's an opportunity for us to entwine ourselves and our productive systems into a wilder matrix, and in doing so kind of kickstart that dynamic mosaic that both created us and we created. And I think the consequence of all this is that we have the possibility to holistically restore ourselves and the world around us as one. So I guess without blabbing on too much, so I don't know how long I've taken, I want to take what we've heard from Russ, what we've heard from Caroline, and what me and Miriam have shared today, and pose you guys a question. Can rewilding and farming actually be separated in modern day Britain? Thank you, and I will now pass back to Caroline.
Thank you so much, guys. That was a really lovely, another lovely presentation. And again, you know, some really, I mean, less radical now, I hope, certainly in these kinds of circles, but certainly sort of conventionally quite radical ideas and concepts in there. And so it'd be really nice to hear. So in response to your question, Rob, and the other two presentations, from people, from the attendees, sort of how those ideas are landing with them. The kind of questions that we've had so far, which actually Russ and Caroline have been diligently sort of answering actually during the presentations, have been quite practical ones. And obviously there are, I mean, the beauty of what you guys are doing is that you are actually implementing these projects, and you know, you are learning as you go with each of those in their unique contexts, how this can work. And you know, we are and we will be in time benefiting from your experiences on those projects. I guess what strikes me often with some of the kind of quite specific and practical questions that come up in these conversations, which I'm quite accustomed to as a permaculturist as well, is that often people do want a sort of a sort of selection of off the peg kind of things that they can implement. And when you're working with dynamic ecosystems that are not static, then your unique context is everything. And actually, the way that you learn and the way you implement these systems often requires a sort of an observation and response approach. So I guess while we're waiting for any more questions to come in response to your question, Rob, I wondered if any of the speakers had anything to say about that in their own experience.
Thanks, Caroline. I'll jump in just very quickly. I realise we're going to be cut off any minute, so I'll start. But yeah, I completely agree, and that's absolutely why I was trying. It's so difficult to talk about this huge subject in 10 minutes, but it's really just about saying that, hey, things have been different at every point in time. They're going to be continuing to be different. They're completely dynamic, and we have a system that's just completely changed. So really, why not we just sit down and say, this is where we are, this is what we've got, and then we try and create a vision for each of, you know, again, we can't sort of say, oh, we should do this everywhere, or we should, you know, we haven't got blanket ownership of land where we've got the option. So we have land in private ownership. That's where we are, whether we like it or not. So I feel the best we can do in that situation is to work with individual landowners, use the holistic management framework. In my, you know, everyone has their own version of how they work with these systems. But for me, it's about sitting down with the landowner and the whole team that's managing that land and saying, what do we want it to be? What is it? What would, you know, looking at everything from what's its history, what was it, what does it want to be, where's succession trying to take it, what's its cultural history, how important is that, what do you as a family want for that farm, you know, how is it then going to make profit, because it's not going to be sustainable if it's not actually making a profit, you know, what do you want to see as a family, as a landscape, you know, and all of this stuff all has to be drawn out, including, as I say, the history of the ecology and all of that backdrop as well, and then we create that unique context for the farm and the land, and really then it's about, as I say, shifting your mindset, thinking of yourself as part of the ecosystem, and as you've said, you know, managing it towards that vision, and then just constantly getting the feedback and knowing that you're never going to be in a static situation. Every year will be different. You'll have to flux and change in your management, and that's very much how we approach it. Yeah, so I'll just let anybody else jump in on that as well. But
Brilliant.
Yeah, I'll concur with that as well. And I think when I showed that sort of spectrum at the beginning, it's everybody's different, and we're all trying to aim for different things, but it's all about moving in a direction of better and improvement and regenerative. And so it's actually probably a healthy thing if there's a mixed fabric of different land management types across the landscape. That suits nature very well, having different environments and ecologies to bed into. And I think that is going to be more of the future. We're going to see more mixed approaches to how we manage the land for biodiversity and food production, and weave those together.
Brilliant, thank you, Russ. And there were a couple of questions in the Q&A that you said you'd like to respond to. I don't know whether you've already done that. There was one about whether the word rewilding really properly describes Knepp, because it doesn't, well, the term rewilding doesn't suggest food production. I wondered if you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think compared to the rewilding project in the Netherlands, which is much bigger than Knepp, actually that's almost not big enough to have a truly wild system. You need to be sort of talking on the sort of Yellowstone scale, so that you can give the animals that chance to migrate and move around and allow fully natural systems. So Knepp in some ways is a little bit managed. The livestock are managed but in a very hands-off way, and nature is allowed to drive the management decisions. It's a natural process-led place. But no, it's perhaps not rewilding in the sense of some bigger areas around the planet could be, but that's where the sort of reality has to be of how we can manage within the confines of the landscape and the roads and where people are living, and safety of people entering and walking on footpaths and that sort of thing. So yeah, there's a mixture of realities in that to consider.
And it's 5 o'clock, so I'm going to have to end it here. We will be creating a Hoover community space so that we can continue these conversations, and I've put links to the websites of all of our speakers and their projects in the chat, so please do get in touch. And I know that Rob and Min in particular are interested to hear from people about an interest in more education along these kinds of lines, and I'm sure Ross and Caroline are too. So the links are there. So thank you to everybody for joining. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I hope you've enjoyed the conference, and let's hope we can all get together in person next year. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Caroline, and thanks everybody for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Carrie. Thank you, everybody.